Today's show is sponsored by CloudZero. For software-driven companies focused on growing margins, CloudZero is the only cloud cost intelligence platform that puts engineering in control by connecting technical decisions to business results. By analyzing cloud services like AWS and Snowflake, CloudZero provides real-time cost insights that help you maximize margins. Engineering teams can answer critical questions like, who are my most expensive customers? How much does this specific feature cost our business? What's the cost impact of re-architecting this application? With cost anomaly alerts via Slack, product-specific data views, and granular engineering context that makes it easy to investigate any cost, CloudZero is your complete cloud cost intelligence platform, connecting the dots between high-level trends and individual line items. Join companies like Drift, Rapid7, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Middle of January 2023. We are into 2023. Hope everybody's doing well. Another Sunday Perspective show. And today I want to kind of follow up a little bit on last week's Sunday Perspective. We sort of did a little bit of a dive into the evolution of Microsoft, how it had evolved from very much the giant sort of legally monopolistic company, it was software company, to how it became sort of a hybrid software / cloud company. And I got to think about that and trying to put in perspective a couple of large companies that really have had a huge impact on what we've done over the years with Cloudcast, but also I know still have a huge impact on what people are doing in their data centers day to day, in their cloud decisions day to day. And as we look back a little bit on 2022, probably the biggest story of the year, if we put stories in context of maybe not necessarily like the biggest innovation of the year, people might argue that had some stuff to do with AI and so forth. But biggest story of the year really was VMware, who had just gone public again, just finally had become an independent company, independent of Dell, gets acquired by Broadcom. And that process is still ongoing. It's not official yet. They've been in limbo for quite a while. I think it goes all the way back to like March or so of last year. So we're probably coming up, nearly a year. But I kind of wanted to look back a little bit and trying to decode a little bit of, the decisions that VMware made. And I think the great question that will always be asked of VMware is not, were they interesting technology? Yeah, absolutely. Were they, completely dominant in an industry for a period of time? Yeah, very much in terms of really reshaping what infrastructure looked like in the data center, but also really kind of, bringing to the forefront the idea of what virtualization could do, compute virtualization, server virtualization. Were they the only ones that did it? No, absolutely not. There were open source projects. There were other companies that were doing this, but they really dominated that space. They really had an impact on, how automation was applied in that space, but also, they were never truly an independent company. They were bought early on in the process by EMC, all the way back in 2004. Yes, they were a public company, but, there was always things influencing, VMware. And so I thought what would be sort of interesting is to sort of look a little bit it's historically how they got to where they are, ultimately, now being acquired by Broadcom, but really look at some of the decisions that were made by VMware over the years. And again, we'll probably never really know unless we get some folks off the record as to, why certain decisions were made at the time, why other decisions weren't made. But I thought it'd be sort of interesting to take a look at that again. It's always interesting to have some historical context of, why things happened, how we got to where we are. And, and then it helps us sort of move forward sometimes to maybe not make the same mistakes twice, sometimes learn from lessons, good and bad as to, how things evolved. And we'll get to that right after the break.
We all know that running global-scale multi-cloud applications is difficult and expensive, but being locked into a single cloud provider sucks. That's why our friends at Section created the platform for easy and cost-effective multi-cloud operations. Section actually makes it easier to operate multi-cloud than on your current single cloud. Applications run in the best locations for end-user performance, reliability, and security, and you get to focus on building your apps, not your infrastructure. Visit section.io/cloudcast to sign up for free with no credit card required. You can be running in under a minute. That's section.io/cloudcast.
And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dive a little bit into, some of the history of VMware, how it got to where it was, how it got from, the early days, early 2000s through it being acquired all the way up to kind of where we are today. But really kind of want to hit on some of the interesting decisions that were made over time, as well as, some of the decisions that might not have been made, right? How many decisions did VMware get to make for themselves? How many were dictated by other things and other entities and so forth? So we're going to dive into that a little bit. And let's go ahead and just jump right into it. So let me just set a little bit of context. So early 2000s, this company, VMware, spins out of Stanford. One of the co-founders is Diane Green. I forget the other co-founder's name. I should go look that up. Bad research on my part. But they take off. They've got two really interesting aspects of the technology early at the time. So they're doing server virtualization, which isn't completely new at the time, but in the x86 world, as opposed to like the mainframe world or anything else, it's fairly new and fairly revolutionary at the time. They really highlight being able to do two things. Number one, be able to turn essentially a physical server running an application into a virtual server. So, the things that we take advantage, we sort of take for granted these days, a virtual machine, being able to do that for multiple operating systems, Linux as well as Windows, across multiple hardware platforms. Again, mostly x86, but understanding all the different chipset requirements of x86, they could do that. So in essence, one of their first big claims to fame is all these servers that are running in data centers that basically, have one application running on them, maybe two, and are highly underutilized in terms of CPU and memory. You can virtualize those, and we can start to aggregate those together onto bigger physical hardware, be able to reduce what might have been 20 servers down to one server or 10 servers down to one server. So the cost optimization possibilities of this technology are huge, right? You can go into basically any company that is running a data center and start making their environment highly efficient. The second technology they have that's probably even more powerful is something they call vMotion. So the ability to take that running application on a server, on a physical server, and be able to move it live without losing any traffic, any sessions to another physical server. And this becomes really powerful for for two reasons. One, for any sort of maintenance scenario in which you got to take something offline and be able to continue to run it. You can do that. You can vMotion something from one server to another. The other is sort of resiliency and failure situations in which if a server fails, the centralized system, vCenter, will move that server, that virtual machine, automatically without losing sessions over to another server, or make sure it's available. So incredibly powerful possibilities in terms of not only cost savings, but also in terms of being able to highly automate data center environments. So really, really interesting technology. So the other couple of interesting things about this, it completely changes the storage paradigm. So instead of having applications that would have local disk storage, in order to take advantage of this virtualization technology, you really needed, especially the vMotion piece of it, you needed to have shared storage. So this was going to really change the storage paradigm within data centers, as well as networking. So you went from physical ports on servers to virtual Ethernet ports, if you will, on all these virtual machines. So it has the ability to not only be incredibly valuable to customers, but also incredibly disruptive to storage and networking within the data centers and potentially into the cloud in the future. But again, this is all sort of pre-cloud technology, right? This is early 2000s. So 2004, storage company EMC decides to acquire VMware for $625 million. They run them as a independent company of EMC. So in theory, they get to run independently. In reality, and we'll talk about this, they were never truly independent. They did have their own board and they had their own management team. But VMware, EMC, as we'll see into the future, was always sort of the majority owner, and that will have long-term ramifications for VMware. Probably the central question of what could have been with VMware. They decide to go IPO. They essentially spin out as an IPO in 2007. Very, very successful IPO. EMC continues to retain, I believe it was 80% of the control of the equity of VMware after the IPO. So there is a public entity, VMW, that trades on the New York Stock Exchange, or I believe maybe the NASDAQ. Anyways, you could buy public VMware stock after 2007, but EMC continued to retain, I think, about 80% of that. So first big thing that happened around 2008, VMware is in their leader, Diane Greene, who some of you may know from if you've been around for a while. Some of you may also remember the name Diane Greene because she was really the first sort of president or CEO of Google Cloud when Google Cloud first launched. So the role that Thomas Kurian has today previously had been Diane Greene, who was, again, the founder and original CEO of VMware. So at that time, Diane is pushing for VMware to be spun out as an independent company, completely independent of EMC. EMC decides, nope, we're making a bunch of money. Not only that, it's also driving a ton of new sales for us in terms of shared storage. So Diane Greene is pushed out of the company. She's replaced, and Paul Maritz, who had been one of the leaders of VMware, one of the leaders of Microsoft, probably one of the top 3 or 4 people at Microsoft, comes in. Paul comes in at the time. He's running, VMware is, primarily a virtualization company, almost entirely virtualization, maybe a little bit of virtual desktop at the time, but mostly server virtualization. VMware 3 is what's out there. VMware 3 is doing relatively well. Again, not a huge business at the time, maybe $1 billion, $1.5 billion. I'd have to go back and look at the numbers. But Paul shepherds them through VMware 3, continuing to do well, which at the time it had been very much, a nice technology to have in the data center, but had certain limitations, couldn't do some of the really, really big applications, some of the really mission critical applications. He shepherds them through VMware 4, vSphere 4. vSphere 4 really kind of knocks down all the barriers that had previously been there in vSphere 3. So the ability to do large VMs, to do large numbers of CPUs, high throughput. So this really allows them to go after any workload. So the SAPs of the world and the Oracles of the world and the databases of the world and so forth. And so it really kind of at that point moved from being an interesting technology, a cost-saving technology, to really becoming sort of a wholesale data center operating system. Now, so at the time, VMware's doing very, very well. They are sort of operating at the time sort of as Switzerland, where they, while they're owned by EMC, and this worries a lot of the people, the companies that compete against EMC, VMware operates very much as sort of Switzerland. They work independently well with NetApp. They work with a lot of the different storage companies. They work independently well with a lot of the different networking companies. And so, they figured out how to be a very good partner and how to, help not only themselves make money, but a lot of other companies make money. So kind of the great sign of, what a good partner in the ecosystem looks like. I think the money numbers at the time, VMware was making for every dollar that VMware made, the ecosystem was making about $8 to $10. So they were a very, very good ecosystem partner. Now, then things get sort of interesting. And this is where we start to get into the questions of like, what if? So, we already talked about what if, VMware had been spun out of EMC. Like, how did that impact their growth? How independent could they have been? And the argument can be made both ways. You could argue that VMware benefited tremendously from being sort of associated with EMC because EMC had a tremendous footprint. They were in all the Fortune 500 companies around the world. And they could go in and introduce VMware into all those accounts that VMware probably would have gotten in because the technology was interesting, but they probably would have come in sort of bottom up, technology centric. EMC was able to bring them in, at the C level, VP level, senior VP level, sort of top down types of sales. So from that perspective, tremendously beneficial for VMware. And again, VMware was able to, for the most part, sort of remain somewhat vendor neutral in terms of their partnerships, right? They probably skewed more towards EMC. EMC would argue that didn't really happen, but I think it did happen. But other vendors were able to work very well with VMware. Now, the flip side of that was, how much did that impact VMware's ability to do innovation, to really kind of, be creative in what they did? And, there probably was certain amounts of things in which, EMC, kind of influenced subtly, or in some cases, heavily, what could be done, what was possible, what sort of dollars should be in R&D and all that sort of stuff. The next thing that really was interesting at the time was when Paul Maritz came on board. Paul Maritz comes over from Microsoft. Microsoft, his background is very much with developers. He had been heavily involved with the developer ecosystem at Microsoft, and he starts moving them not necessarily away from virtualization, but starts making a whole bunch of acquisitions that start looking like he's trying to rebuild Microsoft from within VMware and compete in that space. So he starts buying up companies that, to a certain extent, maybe sort of makes sense. He starts buying companies like Spring and Gemfire. So he kind of gets into the Java developer space. He gets into some of the kind of real-time data database space, which, again, very, very different from what VMware. And then he started getting into sort of collaboration software and some stuff that was going to kind of compete against Microsoft Office. And this is where, things got sort of interesting of like, well, what is VMware? Is it an infrastructure company? Is it a software company that really should be sort of defining a more vertical stack to interact with developers, interact with, more infrastructure things like databases and so forth. And I think looking back, that was a time in which, VMware really could have, reshaped what the computing infrastructure looked like. You had things like Cisco UCS spun out at this time, spun out from some ex-VMware people, kind of the idea of a unified computing, storage, networking type of thing, could have been what was going on at VMware at the time, but that didn't necessarily happen. Did that not happen because of EMC? Did that not happen because Paul Maritz got distracted from infrastructure and started focusing on developers? Should he have doubled down on some of those things around developers? So Spring, obviously, and the work that happened with Gemfire ultimately became what kind of spun out of VMware as pivotal. And, but should that have stayed in-house, right? That's sort of another one of those questions that, I think is an interesting thing. VMware originally had all the early, what became Cloud Foundry technology, but all of the Spring technology. Should that have stayed in-house with VMware? EMC and VMware and Intel and some others spun that out into Pivotal in 2010. It was 2012 or so. Actually, yeah, no, it was 2011, 12 timeframe. It spun out, but should they have stayed? Should that have stayed in house? It would have been difficult because the amount of investment made in Pivotal was like around $3 billion. It would have been difficult because you would have been selling to both developers and app dev teams, but you'd also been selling to infrastructure teams. So difficult to, necessarily cover all those things with one sales force. You probably would have had a certain amount of two sales forces. And then at the time Pivotal spun out, it was trying to be, infrastructure independent, right? So it wasn't going to be tied to VMware. It was going to be working with any cloud infrastructure. It was going to work with OpenStack. It was going to work with AWS and Azure. And, but that sort of a big what if, what if the technologies that had been within VMware in that culture of innovation, in that culture of, developing software, could have been, sort of vertical, would have been a very interesting sort of vertical stack. So around that time, Paul Maritz, who had started 2008 as the CEO, leaves VMware. Pat Gelsinger, who had been forever at Intel. So those of you that know Pat Gelsinger now, who's currently the CEO at Intel, he had been at Intel. He left Intel. He went to EMC. He was the CTO at EMC for a couple of years, and then was moved over to become the CEO of VMware in 2012. So Paul Maritz moves out. Paul Maritz eventually spins out to run Pivotal. Pat takes over, and Pat sort of takes a very different approach. He basically gets rid of all the companies that Paul Maritz had bought. Very interesting. So essentially wipes out what Paul had done over 4 years, and really starts doubling down on sort of infrastructure again. And this is where I think the next question really comes up as to, sort of what if. So around that time, 2012, Pat really moves the company from being Switzerland to what I've said multiple times, and sort of Switzerland with guns. And I don't mean that in a terrible way, but they went from we are going to be the virtualization company that interacts with a lot of technology ecosystem companies to we are going to own a lot more of the infrastructure stack. So 2012, they acquire Nicira. 2014, 2013, they launch vSAN. So Nicira was one of the early software-defined networking companies. So they start owning their own networking stack. 2013, they start getting into the storage space, or what's called hyper-converged space. So they went from having all these sort of storage partners to we're going to take care of storage ourselves as well. And this was tremendously controversial. One at the time, they launched something called the VMware vCloud Hybrid Service, which eventually would become vCloud Air, which was we are going to host a VMware based cloud service that VMware is going to run. It's going to be fully compatible with the entire VMware technology stack. And it was very interesting at the time, but it was something that obviously the transition for a company to go from being a software company to being a cloud operations company was very, very different. And so, it really kind of brings up the question of, should Pat have done that at the time? If we go back and look, 2012, AWS at the time is about a $3 billion company. They're still very small. Should they have said, well, instead of running our own clouds, should we have gone to AWS at the time or any of the cloud providers? But AWS was still really the kind of the 800-pound gorilla at the time, and tried to build the equivalent of what is now the VMware and AWS service back in 2012. Instead of investing in, doubling down to sort of fight your ecosystem, but really kind of shaping what the future, could have been at the time. If we go back and look at the numbers, and I put some links in the show notes that include not only VMware's revenues, but if we think about AWS's revenues as well, 2012, AWS is about $3.5 billion company. By 2016, by the time they have sort of failed with vCloud Air, have shuttered that service to be run by themselves. They sold it off to another company. At that point, AWS is a $12 billion company. So they've quadrupled in size in 4 years. Could VMware have been part of that? Could they have been a bigger part of that, as opposed to essentially going to war with the storage companies, going to war with companies like Nutanix, going to war with the networking companies like Cisco when they bought Nicira? It's an interesting question. They essentially doubled down on we're going to own the stack in the data center, which at the time the data center was still a big spending area. Again, AWS is only a $4 or $5 billion company. But within 2 or 3 years, they're a $12 billion company. And we look now, they're, an 80-something billion dollar company. So, was that short-sighted? Should they have, doubled down earlier into the cloud, as we were seeing the cloud come along, as we were seeing the cloud become, a clear threat to VMware's business. In fact, VMware was telling partners at one of their conferences around the 2012 timeframe, any application that ever moves to AWS will forever be lost from ever being a VMware application, right? So they knew, back in the 2012 days, that AWS and the cloud was going to be a major threat. why didn't they react to that sooner? And why did they think that they could build it themselves when they had no experience in building any cloud, any cloud services? So that becomes another big one. The next one, I think, as we look at kind of where VMware is and how they got to where they are, I think you have to look at, the next big trend that happened, the next big shift that happened, which was the movement away from, well, maybe not the movement away from, but the movement to make it easier, more agile for application developers to build things. And that was Kubernetes. And so, you'd seen VMware spin out Pivotal. They didn't want to be in the application development space. Pivotal had built their own technology in Cloud Foundry for many years. Kubernetes comes along as an alternative to things like Cloud Foundry, but really sort of almost also as an alternative along with things like Docker to VMware. The articles are being written, the headlines are out there. Docker is going to be the new VMware. And VMware really just doesn't adopt it. They do the thing where they go, no, this isn't a big deal. And they could have adopted it all the way back into 2015 for Kubernetes, right? So, what happens if they don't have sort of the hey, containers aren't going to be a big deal. Docker's not a big deal. Kubernetes is not a big deal. Cloud Foundry will take care of that, even though Cloud Foundry as a technology wasn't a VMware technology. It was Pivotal. Pivotal wasn't necessarily aligned in the best interest of VMware. They actually were, trying to abstract away the infrastructure, not be tied to VMware. Why didn't VMware adopt something like Kubernetes, be more involved with this early on in the 2015 timeframe? And you put that in perspective and you look at something like Red Hat OpenShift, which was struggling like crazy prior to Kubernetes when they were building it by themselves. They didn't really have a community around it. They moved to Kubernetes. The story of OpenShift beyond that is well written. It gets acquired by IBM for $33 billion. So, what was not even a $1 billion business, maybe it was a couple $100,000 business, $300,000 or $400,000 business at the time for Red Hat. Turned into a $34 billion acquisition. So, could that kind of value have been created by VMware if they had chosen to be involved with Kubernetes in 2015 as opposed to 2019? At the point when Tanzu was sort of late to market, OpenShift had sort of taken that market in the data center in their space. AKS, EKS had sort of taken Kubernetes outside the cloud. VMware didn't really have a play in that space. So, I think the question as we look back at somebody like VMware and now they're being acquired by Broadcom, what their future will look like is still sort of uncertain. A lot of people tend to think that, it's going to go back to being mostly virtualization based. But if we go back and look at it, it really kind of brings in a bunch of questions. Why did certain leaders make certain decisions? They made decisions that were, very much aligned to the personality they had and the technologies they knew. Diane Green was trying to be innovative. She was trying to get outside of the EMC footprint. EMC wanted them brought back in. Paul Maritz comes in, is very much more in line with EMC, but then tries to take it in sort of a developer and Microsoft sort of direction, something that maybe they weren't prepared for. Maybe it would have been a good idea for them, but they just didn't commit to, weren't tremendously successful with. Pat Gelsinger comes in. The cloud is at the time an imminent threat. They know it's an imminent threat. They don't execute to try and partner in the ways that maybe the partnerships would have worked. They try and go at their own. It doesn't work. The cloud races by them, and they end up getting into the cloud 4 years too late. And then Kubernetes comes along, is redefining what infrastructure looks like within the data center. It's potentially disrupted their technology, but it's also potentially, a great sort of add-on to their technology. They ignore it for 4 years, in essence. A bunch of other ways or approach to it, and they miss that mark. For the most part, they're 4 years late to market in that space, and others have sort of taken that market. So, VMware is an interesting thing. They were a tremendously successful company. The one interesting thing is, for a long time, I mean, they're now a $20 billion company, but for a long time, they were never more than a $10 billion company. And when we think about the really big, important companies, in our industry, they're typically 30, 40, 50, $100 billion companies. VMware never really reached that exit velocity, but they did have tremendous impact on the data center. They reshaped an entire generation of technologists within data centers for a decade. So tremendously impactful. But it is interesting to me to look back at some of the decisions they made, whether they were the right decisions at the time, the wrong decisions at the time, and to really kind of wonder, how much they would have done differently if they had been independent. They were never truly independent. I mean, they were owned by EMC through their IPO. They were owned by EMC up until the point where Dell acquired EMC, and then Dell owned them through being owned by Dell, but then sort of owned secondarily by EMC. So it's a lot of what ifs. It's a really interesting company to sort of what if. Again, excellent technology for what they did, especially around virtualization. But a couple of big technology trend misses over the last 20 years that sort of brought us to a point where it looks like they're probably going to get back to just being primarily a virtualization company, and maybe that's what they should be. But again, once again, they are owned by somebody else, and a lot of the decisions of what their future looks like is probably going to be dictated somewhat by the interest of somebody other than themselves. So interesting to take a look at, interesting historically to kind of go back and see what could have been. And so with all that, I'll wrap it up. Another Sunday perspective. Again, I put a lot of links in the show notes if you kind of want to go back and do some historical, kind of piecing the pieces together. And if anybody from VMware at the time, Pat Gelsinger, or anybody wants to come on and sort of, tell us where we got things wrong, we'd love to sort of hear more. So with that, I'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.